Hi, I'm Brady.
Hi, I'm Merritt,
And
and
this
this
is
is
the
the
Team
Team Radio
Radio
Podcast.
Podcast. Welcome back to the Team Radio Podcast. This is our 5th episode, our recap of the Austrian Grand Prix. But before we get into that, we're going to share with you our favorite Team Radio moment from last week, the Styrian GP at the same track in Austria, the Red Bull Ring. My favorite, personally, I really like this one. My favorite Team Radio moment from last week's Grand Prix was Carlos Sainz's engineer. After Carlos crossed the line, he said, "Carlos, P6, P6, super race, well done." And then he started singing the Baby Shark song, and that caught me really off guard. I found it very funny. All right, back to the present with the Austrian Grand Prix. Merritt, how about you take it away with the qualifying recap?
Yeah, really quickly to recap what went on during qualifying. First and foremost, we have a change in the tire compounds for this week. So if you don't know, F1 has 5 different tire compounds, and then they can range from the category soft, medium, to hard. And they can kind of shift around on the sliding scale. And it's kind of confusing to understand if you don't actually see like a picture of it with it drawn out. So the only thing you really have to know is that this week's hard compound tires were last week's medium compound tires. And so the tires this week were significantly softer than they were last week. Another big thing that happened was a little bit of a scandalous penalty awarding to Sebastian Vettel, who got a 3-place grid penalty, if I'm correct?
3 places, I believe.
Yeah, 3 places for holding up Fernando Alonso in the Q2 qualifying. Now, the reason why it's a little contentious is because Seb was behind a whole chain of cars that were also going slow in this one corner where they were told they weren't allowed to go slow. And eventually the FIA came out and they said that the reason Seb got the penalty was because they could clearly see that he was in the wrong, but for the other drivers, it's harder to really put concretely that they were in the wrong. So a little unfair to Seb, but because of that, George Russell, who qualified P9 for the first time in Q3 for Williams. Round of applause, everybody. I'm so proud. Celebrations, fireworks, all the above. Anyways, so not only was George Russell in P9, but because of this penalty from Sebastian Vettel, he got to go up to P8. Other interesting news is Lando Norris got front row qualifying P2. And guys, he was so close to Max. I mean, it was milliseconds between them.
I think it was 4 thousandths of a second, right?
4 thousandths of a second to get on pole. That is some tight racing. There was a quote that the commentators used to talk about Lando's performance during qualifying and during practice and the whole weekend. And basically, you have to push the limit to find the limit. And when you find the limit, you find the pace. And this is kind of something we're going to see play out in Lando's weekend. Now, just to give you some context on how the race is shaking up at the start, I'm going to run down the first top 10 track positions at the starting grid for this race. So we have Max Verstappen on pole, Lando Norris next to him in second, Sergio Perez in third with Lewis Hamilton next to him. In fifth, we have Bottas. In sixth, Gasly. In seventh, we have Yuki Tsunoda. Of course, in eighth, we have George Russell, followed by Lance Stroll. And then rounding up the top 10, we have Carlos Sainz in P10.
Moving on to our next segment, Poles and Pit Lanes, where we take a look at 3 of the weekend's biggest winners and 3 of the weekend's, we'll say, underachievers. Speaking of Carlos, he is our first pole of the weekend. Carlos, of course, started the race in P10 and worked his way all the way up to P5. Now, he was another beneficiary of Sebastian Vettel's penalty. He qualified P11 but started P10, and he finished the race P6, but because of a penalty from Sergio Perez, ended up moving into 5th after the race had ended. Carlos was the last driver on the grid to make his first pit stop. He stretched his hard tires nearly 50 laps, which is even more impressive once you realize that these hard tires, like we mentioned, were equivalent to the medium tires of last race. So when you think about it, he stretched those tires, I believe it was 49 laps before making a pit stop. And thanks to team orders, late in the race, Carlos was able to get past his teammate Charles Leclerc and swiftly overtake Daniel Ricciardo right as the race was sort of winding down.
Next we have Lando Norris. Now, like we said, Lando started on the front row. He was able to hold up the Mercedes for a while, but then was eventually passed by Lewis. And then, unfortunately, was hurt even further because of a 5-second penalty he got when he was racing really tight with Checo. Kind of didn't give Checo enough room, forced Checo off the track into the gravel area. And so that gave him a 5-second penalty. And ultimately, what Lando felt, and what a lot of people watching the race felt, was that Lando could have probably gotten second position. But, guys, he got third position nonetheless, despite losing track positions to Hamilton. Despite this 5-second penalty, he was able to fight his way back up to third place. And now Lando can partly thank his pit stop strategy for this race podium. He did a one-stop strategy, which turned out to be the best strategy in the race, going from the mediums, which he had qualified on, switching to the hards, and that really brought it home for him. And he is now only 3 points behind Checo, fighting for P3 in the Drivers' Championship. So those were some major points for him today. And finally, not to mention, on top of all of this, Lando got Driver of the Day.
Yeah, everything was going really smoothly for the McLaren. We'll touch on the tire strategy a little bit later in our pit lane segment as well, but like you said, Merritt, the one stop was the way to go this weekend. Our final poll of the weekend was, of course, Max Verstappen. How could it not be?
Brady, we've had 5 podcast episodes, and Max has been a poll in 4 of them.
I did not know that. Am I surprised?
Yes.
Not even a little bit. Max has been on an absolute tear recently, and he's capped off this really incredible run by getting the first quote-unquote Grand Slam of his career. Now, for those of you who don't know, a Grand Slam in Formula One includes pole position, a race win, the fastest lap, and leading every lap of the race. So just absolute dominance throughout the entire weekend. Max provided it. Max even asked his engineers if he could try for a second fastest lap. He had held fastest lap for much of the race, but as his lead started to extend, he asked his engineers if he could come into the pit stop once again, put on a fresh set of soft tires, and really gun for that extra fastest lap. And of course he got it. This makes 3 race wins in a row for Max, and in those 3 wins he won by 3 seconds, 35 seconds, and then 18 seconds. And of course, this past weekend was the 18-second win, and that was after his second pit stop. So Max has been just truly dominant. And that reflects in the standings. He's currently 32 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton in the Drivers' Championship standings, of course, in P1.
Next, let's move into our pit lanes. These are the biggest disappointments, biggest blunders of the day. And our first one is not a driver. It's not even a team. It is the FIA stewards, everybody. These are the people that make sure everyone's following the rules. If things seem a little sketchy, they investigate, they award penalties, they clear up misunderstandings, etc., etc. And I don't know what it was, but they were trigger happy today, everybody. They gave out 7 penalties during the race. That's not even counting the penalties they gave Seb before the race. Now, I'm going to read these out to you guys. A 5-second penalty to Giovinazzi for overtaking while the safety car is deployed. Another 5-second penalty for Lando Norris for forcing another driver off the track. That was the whole situation with Checo, which we touched on. Then a 5-second penalty for Yuki Tsunoda for crossing the line at the pit lane entry. And then we have a 5-second penalty for Sergio Perez for forcing another driver off the track, basically doing exactly what Lando did to him to Charles Leclerc. Then we get another 5-second penalty to Sergio Perez for forcing another driver off the track. But this other driver was the same driver from the first time. Poor Charles. And then we have a 5-second penalty to Stroll for speeding in the pit lane. And then finally, we have another 5-second penalty to Yuki Tsunoda for crossing the line at the pit lane entry. So we have 2 5-second penalties for both Perez and Yuki Tsunoda for doing the same thing. And now, my thoughts on this are that they gave Lando Norris that first penalty and then really put themselves in a corner. When that whole incident with Checo and Lando first happened, they even had Christian Horner on the phone and they asked him what he thought, and he said, "That's just driving, they're just racing hard." Christian was not pushing for a penalty against Lando, even though Lando hurt his, quote-unquote, hurt his driver. So if Christian Horner, a guy who will do anything he can to get ahead, wasn't going to pursue penalties, I don't know why they were awarding this. And in the long term, it hurt Red Bull, or at least hurt Sergio Perez's performance. And then, of course, the FIA put themselves in this corner where, because they gave Lando this penalty, and it took them 20 laps to decide on this penalty. But then they finally set a precedent, and so then when it happened with Perez, they gave the penalty seconds after it happened and really put themselves in a corner. And these penalties ended up costing Checo a place, nearly cost Lando a podium, really hurt the chances of Stroll and Yuki, and just overall really messed up the trajectories of many of these drivers.
Yeah, I've heard some discourse online of some Formula One fans seem to think, oh, but the stewards were consistent, okay? Yeah, consistently wrong. At least in the case of Lando and Sergio Perez's penalties. Those are racing incidents.
Agreed.
Those should not have been penalties.
They are 100% racing incidents. And if this was on a track like Paul Ricard, where they didn't have the gravel traps, when it was just like concrete runoff, we see cars get forced off all the time and have to come back in. It happened at Bahrain. It happens at Paul Ricard. The only reason it seems really serious here is because they have this gravel thing. And then the cars drive and they kick up smoke. And of course, since it's gravel, it hurts the cars. So going off on gravel versus going off on like tarmac or whatever it is, obviously is going to hurt the cars.
The rumble strips.
So, yeah, like it hurts them, but it's no different than if you were racing somewhere else. It's just a different material under them. Anyways, enough said on this subject.
Well, enough said on the subject of Lando and Sergio Perez. Our next pit lane is Yuki Tsunoda. Listen, I was defending Lando and I was defending Checo just now, but what happened to Yuki? I mean, he got 2 5-second penalties for the same thing.
Yeah, that was Yuki's fault. And for something that's very dangerous.
It is very dangerous. I guess, in theory, he crossed the white line of the pit entry lane too late. That was the issue both times. He entered the pit lane twice and was penalized both times for the exact same thing. And that was clearly just a rookie mistake. Like, what really are you going to do at that point? Mm-hmm. Tsunoda, of course, qualified in P7 and finished P12. And I think a large part of that, of course, was the penalties. But beyond that, the two-stop tire strategy did not do him any favors. AlphaTauri and Aston Martin were the two teams on the grid to do two-stop strategies, because each of those teams were forced to start on the soft compound tires. So there really wasn't anything else they could do, but they were really put at a disadvantage for pretty much the entire race. And like we said, Yuki's penalties didn't help at all.
Like we said, the tires this race were significantly softer than the ones last race. So the soft tires in this race were not the same soft tires as last race. So when we had some of these drivers starting on the soft tires from their qualifying laps, they really worn out quickly and really disadvantaged them. Next we have our last pit lane, Esteban Ocon. Now, I'm kind of sad that we're talking about him again here, considering how well he was doing at the start of the season. He didn't have a great qualifying. He qualified P17, which we know he can do better than that. What is he doing there? Then he had a bad race start. To give him some credit, this incident that happened that caused him to DNF on the first lap of the race was not his fault necessarily. It was a racing incident. On his first push on the first lap, when you're trying to make up as many places as you can, he found himself sandwiched between Mick Schumacher and Antonio Giovinazzi. Now, Antonio, in an attempt to get ahead, clipped his front right tire, caused Ocon to spin and go off track, and ended his day immediately. Now, the reason why this is such a pit lane for Esteban Ocon is just because he hasn't scored any points since Monaco. And we kind of gave Daniel Ricciardo a hard time for a similar dynamic. A driver we know can do a lot better and who we've seen little moments in the season doing a little bit better, but then they let go, they drop the ball. So that's why Ocon is in our pit lane today.
You brought up Daniel Ricciardo, who's a pretty interesting comparison here because, yeah, they've both struggled at times. Ricciardo was struggling earlier on in the season, and Ocon is beginning to struggle more now. But I think it's almost worse for Ocon because he's supposed to be their guy. He's signed through 2023 or 2024 or what have you. He's supposed to be Alpine's lead driver. And of course, Fernando Alonso is a legend, and it'll be hard to outperform him no matter what car he's in. But eventually, Ocon's going to have to be the guy. He's going to have to stop qualifying in 17th place, you know? There's that added pressure that isn't there for Ricciardo because, of course, McLaren has Lando Norris as the face of their team.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Absolutely.
I think you raise a really valid point, and I think for Alpine, this is not a good look for them. They just signed on Ocon for another several years. They were really looking forward to him being their top driver. He was doing so good at the beginning of the season. But for the actual individual drivers themselves, I would argue that this is a better position for Ocon than for Daniel Ricciardo, because Esteban Ocon knows he has a seat for the next several years. He doesn't have to worry about impressing the other teams, impressing his own team. He can sit pretty. He has enough flexibility to have kind of a couple bad races one after another because he knows he has time to improve and he doesn't have to stress about finding a new seat. Daniel Ricciardo, of course, is signed with McLaren for until, 2023, 2022?
I believe 22.
22. Yes, it was a 2-year contract, you're right. So after that, he's going to have to start seeing if McLaren still wants to work with him, if he needs to impress other teams. And so I'm not denying what you said is not right, because I think for Alpine, the team, what you're saying is very astute. But I think if you're looking at stress over the driver market, Ocon can sleep a little bit easier at night.
Another thing to consider is also Daniel Ricciardo's age. I believe he'll be 33 or 34 by the time his contract with McLaren is up. And, you know, in sports terms, that's getting to the end of your career. But then, of course, to go back to Alpine, they've got F2's leading driver in Guan Yu Zhou just kind of sitting there waiting for an opportunity. And, of course, the plan was sign Ocon for multiple years, have him be your lead driver, bring Zhou into the lineup once Fernando Alonso retires, and you've got a great young driver duo moving forward. But Alonso has scored 20 of Alpine's 32 points this season, Ocon is DNFing, and Guan Yu Zhou can barely even get into a Friday practice session. Really not how they envisioned this season going so far. Let's move on to our team recap segment, where we go through every team on the grid, talk about their highs, talk about their lows, talk about the tea, talk about the juice, what have you. And of course, like always, we go in order of the team's highest placing finisher on the grid. So yet again, 5th time in a row, we start with Red Bull. Yet another W. You're welcome, Christian Horner. I am convinced our podcast was the best thing to happen to the Red Bull team. I cannot be persuaded otherwise at this point. I can comfortably say that Red Bull is also the best car on the grid. I no, that's not necessarily a super popular opinion given the dominance of Mercedes over the past decade, but I really do believe that Red Bull has outpaced Mercedes in almost every race this year. Max, of course, started on pole and finished with the win. Checo started P3 and finished P6. Now, we've talked about Max already, and we've touched on Checo, who had a very up and down day. Ultimately, he did have quite a nice drive, considering he had 2 penalties and still only lost 2 places from his original starting position. But, those penalties were iffy. He was battling with the likes of the Ferraris for a while, which generally you want to see Sergio Perez ahead of the Ferraris. But he was able to come out on top and finish. He finished in 5th, of course, but the penalties knocked him down to P6. It could have been a lot worse, is what I'm trying to say.
Next, we have Mercedes. Now, it was an interesting day for Mercedes. We have Hamilton qualifying P4 and ending P4. It's kind of a rare occurrence for Hamilton to be so low, but lately, it's looking to be more and more like the standard. A P3, a P4 seems to be like an average for Hamilton over the last couple races, or at least in the races that we've covered in this podcast. Now, Bottas, as usual in Austria, seemed to take really good care of his tires. He seemed quite quick. And we had a very rare instance of team orders for Bottas in which they said that he was free to race Lewis. They realized, Lewis just isn't fast enough. We're not going to keep him ahead of Bottas for the sake of the championship points, because at this point we feel like Bottas can do better. They go on to the radio quite some bit after Bottas asked about it, and they go, yes, you're free to race Lewis. Now, this allowed Bottas to shoot up into 2nd position. Before all this happened, of course, we had some very interesting battles with Lando Norris for those 2 podium positions. Bottas eventually passed Lando Norris in the pit lane while Lando was serving a 5-second drive-through penalty. And Lewis passed as well, but then was eventually repassed by Lando back out on the track.
Yeah, and there was a really nice moment between Lewis Hamilton and Lando Norris. After Lewis passed Lando the first time around, he gave his compliments to his engineer. He said something along the lines of, "Oh, Lando, what a great driver." It's just something you really like to see. An older British driver and legend of the sport kind of giving props to the up-and-coming young British driver. It was really fun.
And, Lewis has made similar comments or comments in the same vein to George Russell, also another young up-and-coming British driver. And you really get the sense that Lando Norris and George Russell, who again is in talks for a Mercedes seat, are really the future of the British racing drivers.
Not only the British racing drivers, but I believe of the sport. Although, Max Verstappen may have something to say about that. But back on topic. We're talking about Lando Norris. Can't talk about Lando Norris without talking about McLaren, right? Another really great day for McLaren. Lando finished in 3rd place on the podium, and Daniel Ricciardo, despite starting in P13 for a 2nd straight race, finished P7. Both of them were on one-stop strategies, of course. Daniel Ricciardo burst from P13 all the way into the points very early on in the race, like we saw at the Austrian Grand Prix, but this time, he didn't lose those places back. His car held up, and he was able to stick in the points. Ricciardo was battling with both Ferrari drivers and Sergio Perez for most of the race, and God, watching those 4 cars go at it was very entertaining. Thanks to those great finishes, McLaren built up a little bit of distance between themselves and Ferrari for 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship, and Lando Norris is catching up to Checo for 3rd place in the Drivers' Championship, which is very interesting to see a driver that young be that impactful so early on. On the topic of Drivers' Championship standings, Daniel Ricciardo was able to pass Pierre Gasly for 8th place, which is a good thing to see for Ricciardo after a bit of a rough start to his year.
Our next team is Ferrari. It was a pretty decent day for the Scuderia. Carlos went P10 to P5. We already talked a little bit about him in our poll section, so I won't touch too much on it. And then we had Charles go P12 to P8. It was a little bit of a harder day for Charles with all the contention that we had with Checo and the battling that happened and a lot of off-road gravel driving for Charles. Now, importantly, we had a brilliant overcut strategy for both Ferrari drivers. Charles was the last medium tire runner to make his pit stop. And Carlos, like we already talked about, was the last driver on the grid to stop. Charles went mediums to hard, and Carlos went hards to mediums. And eventually, it played out really well for both of them. They both scored some good points, and even though they lost ground to McLaren, they shouldn't feel bad about their day. They're still holding on, and they're not too far behind McLaren.
Yeah, when you look at how they performed this weekend as opposed to how they drove last year, for example, it's really nice to see because the cars were holding up, the drivers were performing well, and I think most importantly, at least in this race, the team was performing well. The tire strategy was good. There weren't any pit stop miscues. There weren't any silly mistakes, the types of stuff you would see from 2020 Ferrari. Ultimately, it was a really nice example of how Ferrari is bouncing back from that terrible year, and it's great to see. Moving on, we have AlphaTauri. Pierre Gasly started P6 and dropped down to P9, and as we mentioned before, Yuki Tsunoda qualified in 7th and finished in 12th. Now, AlphaTauri, both of their drivers lost places due to the two-stop tire strategy, which of course ultimately was the slower strategy. Because both Gasly and Yuki made Q3, they were forced to start on their soft compound tires, like we mentioned, and these are quote-unquote extra soft tires that were absolutely torched by the curbs and the hot track temperatures and what have you. And that strategy kind of limited how much AlphaTauri really could have done in this race. Gasly had to carve up the midfield and put together a really great drive just to get into the points at P9. So for him to get any higher than that would have taken either a miracle or a different strategy.
Next, we have Alpine. It wasn't the best day for Alpine. It wasn't the worst day. It was kind of an average day, and this is something we're seeing a lot of recently from Alpine, just averageness. You know, Alonso just barely stole a point back from George Russell, passing him in those last, 3 laps to get P10. Really quickly, though, I would like to mention that in the post-race interviews, Alonso was talking about how when he realized he was going to be racing and battling with George Russell to get that last point, he said, no, anyone but Russell. And I think that plays to the fact that we were everyone in F1 was recognizing that this could have been the day that George Russell got P10. And it's really nice to see this world champion, recognize how much George Russell deserves this and feeling kind of bad about having to take that point away from him. But at the same time, props to Alonso. I mean, he got the job done. He got that point for himself. Ocon's day, on the other hand, was a lot less positive. I mean, we already talked about it in our pit lane, so I won't be repetitive, but he lost out in that opening lap, was not able to finish the race, once again, did not get any points for the team, and because of that, Alpine is slowly losing ground to AlphaTauri and to Aston Martin. And if they don't fix things soon, we can easily see them slip down the Constructor Championship standings.
Yeah, they're currently 7th place in the standings right now, and like you said, if something doesn't change, it may be too late for them to go any higher than that. Next on our list is a team who does have hope, Williams. Now, for Williams, today was just heartbreaking, despite this being their highest finish in this segment in our podcast's very short history. George Russell, of course, qualified in P8 and finished in P11 yet again. And Nicholas Latifi qualified P18, finished P16. Good for him. We'll get to him later. Let's talk about the big story of today. George Russell was fantastic today for the most part. Despite being really eaten alive at the very beginning of the race, he went from P8 all the way down to P12, but was able to hold off the rest of the grid, work his way back up into P10, and hold that points position for a very long time. He held off the two-stop Aston Martin strategists and was running in that points position nearly the whole race, nearly scoring his first points as a Williams driver before, of course, being overtaken by Fernando Alonso with 3 laps to go in the race. And we knew it was going to happen. The Williams just wasn't quick enough to keep up with the Alpine. George was doing everything he could. He was driving perfectly on his racing line. He was being defensive, but we knew it was pretty much inevitable that Alonso was going to get past. Latifi, on the other hand, was able to gain a place, thanks to Sebastian Vettel crashing on the final lap of the race. We'll get to that in a second. Latifi, you gotta find your good moments throughout the season, and this was one of them for him. He can now officially say that he finished ahead of Sebastian Vettel in a real Formula One race that counts, so good for him.
Our next team is Aston Martin. It's kind of sad seeing them so far down the list today. They, of course, were another casualty of the two-stop strategy that really hurt them like we saw it hurt AlphaTauri. It was a day to forget for Aston Martin, and they weren't able to capitalize on a poor performance from AlphaTauri. Now, of course, Pierre Gasly did his best and got 2 points for the team, but Aston Martin, they got no points for the team. We had Stroll starting P9, finishing P13, and Sebastian Vettel starting P11 and then not finishing the race because of this wild crash that literally happened on the last lap of the race between him and Kimi Räikkönen, which sent Sebastian Vettel flying off the track. Stroll was passed easily by George Russell, who's racing in a Williams. And of course, that's not to take away from the fact that George is a very talented driver, but still, it should not have been so easy for George to get around Stroll.
Our next team is Alfa Romeo. Speaking of that Sebastian Vettel-Kimi Räikkönen crash, let's talk about it a little bit. It was very strange. I believe it was on not only the last lap, but the last turn. And based on their onboard team radio clips, it seemed like neither Kimi nor Seb saw each other, really. Is it possible that they were both in each other's blind spots as they were making that turn? Neither of them really knew why it happened, per se. It was very strange to see and just kind of caught us all off guard. Anyways, back to Alfa Romeo. Kimi Räikkönen finished P15 after qualifying P16, and Antonio Giovinazzi finished 14th after qualifying 15th. Sounds good, right? Well, no. Thanks to Esteban Ocon's DNF, neither of them effectively really gained a place. I think, personally, it's time to switch it up for Alfa Romeo. We've seen what this driver lineup can do, and I'm out. They're fun. I get it. Kimi Räikkönen, the Iceman, we love him. Antonio Giovinazzi, Jesus, I guess. I don't know.
Jesus. The only guy that can make Kimi smile.
The only guy that can make Kimi smile. I don't know, maybe hire him as an engineer or something. Let's get somebody fresh in there. How about like Callum Ilott from Formula 2? I don't care really who it is that is replaced, but Alfa Romeo needs a direction, and they don't have one.
And last and certainly least, we have Haas. Typical day in the office. Haas and last. We had Mick start second to last, finish second to last. Mazepin start last, finish last. Really, not much to say. If anything, Haas's most interesting storyline this season is this whole gift-giving situation between Günther Steiner and Nikita Mazepin, a little cheeky situation between the two dudes. Of course, Günther Steiner offered Nikita Mazepin a spinning top, referencing the Mazaspin memes and the fact that Nikita Mazepin was spinning quite a lot at the beginning of this season. And in return, Nikita Mazepin offered Günther a giant office door. And for fans of Formula One and Drive to Survive, you will remember that Kevin Magnussen smashed this door in a fit of anger after a confrontation between him and Romain Grosjean. And it was just a little cheeky move from Mazepin and brought smiles to all of our faces, despite his actual performances on the track.
Speaking of Drive to Survive, let's move on to our next segment, the Drive to Survive moment of the day, in which we take a look at the moment in the race that we believe will be highlighted by Netflix's incredible show, Drive to Survive. Normally, these moments are accented with very dramatic music and sound effects, and intercut with clips of normally Christian Horner saying something very vague and a little bit threatening.
Yeah.
But the moment from this race is Mazepin giving Günther Steiner the door. Kidding, of
JK.
course. I got you, though, didn't I?
Though it will definitely be in there.
I sure hope it is.
No, it will be in there. Netflix loves their Günther content.
Don't we all?
Yes.
Anyways, our real Drive to Survive moment of the day was Valtteri Bottas passing Lewis Hamilton after the team orders that allowed the two teammates to race. Bottas, of course, passed Lewis and finished P2. This was the first time Bottas had finished ahead of Hamilton, I think, since Baku, since the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't have the results up in front of me. But this was a really good day from Bottas, and a very interesting twist in, of course, this Mercedes storyline we've been talking about, with the Mercedes second seat being up for grabs between Bottas or potentially George Russell. That concludes this episode of the Team Radio podcast. Of course, this was our review of the Austrian Grand Prix. Tune back in 2 Sundays for our recap of the historic Silverstone Grand Prix. As always, my name is Brady.
And I'm Merritt.
Bye-bye.
Beep beep.